Hello and welcome to this week's lecture on partnering and contracting relationships. We're moving on from the last 2 weeks where we've been concerning ourselves with the basic tools and techniques of project management, critical path method, resources management, crashing of time, smoothing of resources and so on. And the next few weeks and the remainder of this course, we're going to look more at the real issues that face managers of projects. Obviously, these are compounded because project managers have to manage across organizational boundaries and work with people from outside, including outsourcing activities and so on. And also, it becomes even more complex in an international situation. This module is about managing international projects, and very often our partners or subcontractors are based overseas, some way distant from where we're operating. So what we will be looking at this week. So this week's topic, partnering and contracting relationships. We're first going to look at project partnerships, what they are and why they become so attractive to many industries generally, but also specifically for project management. We're going to consider some of the benefits. We're going to be reflecting on negotiating and contracting in partnership. I'm going to talk you through an exercise that we do in class normally during the lecture. And then we're going to look at the rather thorny issue of PPP, public-private partnerships, look at why those were developed and why they were seen as being attractive, but also look more critically at some of the issues concerned. And then we're finally going to consider cooperation in international projects. The readings this week, the book from one of the two core textbooks, Catherine Custer, is the reading for this week from the text. Chapter 10 looks at some of the issues we're concerning ourselves with in an international context. Then we've got two further articles which are shown there. I'm not going to read through all the names of the first article, but Martin Heikia et al., a more recent article looking at managing inter-organizational networks for value creation. And that's quite an interesting review of some of the issues in managing across boundaries within projects. And then the second suggested journal article reading is the one by Manu et al. And that looks at the issue of trust, because trust obviously runs central to partnerships. And the article itself looks at trust influencing factors in main contractor and subcontractor relationships. So those are two up-to-date articles that look at managing inter-organizational networks, but then also the second one focuses in on the issue of trust in partnerships. So just some initial thoughts. First of all, we recognise, of course, that many projects cross organisational boundaries and will involve the project manager working with outside partners. So these outside organisations might be suppliers of some of the equipment, of some of the materials we might be using, of some of the services we require, or it could be dealing with customers or clients or recipients or users. In other words, dealing further downstream with the end customer, and also often involves working with contractors. Some of the work, some of the activities on the project could well have been outsourced to other contractors. Clearly, it's very rare today for all project work to be conducted in-house, and it's almost unknown, of course, for all project work, all activities on any large project to be done completely in-house. And we've seen over the last few years a rise in outsourcing. Now, clearly this has implications for the project manager. Increased outsourcing means more need for developing skills of partnership and managing across boundaries with suppliers, contractors, customers, and so on. There's been a big emphasis on partnering, and partnering, what we're talking about there is working together in partnership. the development of longer term relationships. And clearly that's contrary to the more traditional approach to procurement, to managing outside, which will be the often adversarial relationships between parties. So the idea of partnering is that it builds upon long-term trust. So key concerns here are to do with how do we ensure control of the project, given that we're working with outside partners and contractors. But clearly, a major factor in ensuring that the project completes successfully and that we have a very positive relationship is that that relationship should be built on trust. So trust is a very central concern for managing project partnerships. Now at this point in the lecture, I would show the video Getting the Most from Contractors. It's 7 minutes long, so I encourage you now to find that on the KLE and to watch that video, which gives you a good introduction to the idea of partnership and specifically management of contractors. So having watched the video and got some background, let's focus in on the benefits of partnership. So why is partnership important? Well, normally when we refer to partnership in projects, the notion is that that partnership probably continues across multiple projects. It's not just a one-off as it would be in the past with traditional procurement, but in fact you'd look to work in the longer term, to work with your partners, with your preferred suppliers and partners over time and across multiple projects. Now the benefits are clearly it reduces the transactions and administrative costs. We can make use of resources, so we can share information. We've worked together over periods of time with contractors, so we can develop known schedules. We can mutually work together on clearer forecasts of work. The notion is as well that we've got better communication because we've worked with those partners over periods of time. We've developed mutual understanding of how we operate, what the expectations are, and so on. The other argument is that partnership facilitates innovation, that over time we've developed trust, the T word again, and we're able to have an open arena, a more trusting environment whereby we can discuss ideas and share risks as well. And then finally, the notion is that we have improved performance generally, that the standard of work and the expectations increase over time as we develop a modus operandi, as we work and understand how each other work from one project to the next. Now, we've already mentioned partnering and how it compares to traditional practices, but let's have a look at the rise of partnering and how it compares and contrasts to more traditional practices based upon procurement. Well, first of all, I should say this is adapted from the textbook Larson and Gray, the big American textbook that we've used and referred to before, but I've just clipped this down from there, adapted it a little bit. So in comparing partnering with traditional practices, what we have here is that, first of all, the idea is that we develop mutual trust, and this forms the basis for strong working relationships. Traditional practices often involve suspicion and mistrust. Each party's wary of the other. We're sort of end up working against each other if we're not careful rather than working together. Partnering idea, shared goals and objectives ensure a common direction, whereas the traditional practice would be there wouldn't be that common goal. The supplier and the customer, or the contractors and the project management organisation will be just working towards their own goals and what's best for them. I won't run through each one in detail, you can read those through, but we can start to see the idea of developing joint project teams, the idea of open communication and working relationships developing over time, and long-term commitment of partners to our projects. And moving on, continuing those factors, we can start to see that there are benefits as well in terms of performance and assessment of performance, sharing of information, access to resources, commitment and involvement through the partners, and integration of admin, planning systems, better understanding, and also risk is shared equally among partners rather than just simply trying to transfer it to the other party. Okay, so that's the positive side of partnerships. Essentially, clearly partnership means that there's a degree of outsourcing involved, but the notion is in developing trust and partnerships that you develop benefits from that. But clearly in developing any partnership, a major skill is the idea of negotiation, and also the need to set the terms of a contract is really important from the outset of any partnership or new project. Now, I want to say that a contract is more than just a piece of paper. It's more than just an agreement or an arrangement. It's a codification within law. It's the legal binding contract that governs the relationship between the parties. So it doesn't just involve setting the price, but also might well govern things such as change control, the extent to which we can modify the contract, and the way in which we work within the partnership. Now, okay, you might say, well, if we have a wonderful relationship and shared mutual understanding, do we really need to go back to the contract? But the contract is really important as a terms of reference in the first place for setting up any partnership. Now, clearly as well, negotiation is really important. It's a really important activity in the art of developing a contract and also continuing on in managing the subsequent partnership. Now, when we say negotiation, we often think about, trade union negotiations, very current at the moment, of course, but it doesn't have to be adversarial. And the idea of negotiation in projects and contracting and partnerships within contracts, within projects, is that it shouldn't be seen as a competitive contest. The idea is the skill is really in how you deal with behavior of other people and also how you deal with unreasonable behavior from other parties, but it requires objectivity. The idea is that you explore and focus on the issues and interests of both parties, try not to simply develop entrenched positions or adversarial personal relationships. So this is a really important part of the whole process of working in partnership. Negotiation in terms of setting up the contract in the first place, but also negotiation in managing the subsequent partnership and relationship with your suppliers. Now at this stage, what I normally do is set an exercise where some groups of students take the part of a local government organisation, a local council or local education authority who are commissioning the construction of a new primary school. And this group of students, what you would do is that you're wanting to delegate detailed design of the school to a private sector construction partner. And you want them to A, design this new primary school, but also you're looking to develop a long-term relationship with that partner so that as well as designing a specific school, you can work with them in the future on projects. So that group, what I normally ask you to do is to take 5 minutes out and identify what objectives you have for the school project and also what concerns or issues you have from your own local government perspective in terms of the project itself, and particularly issues or concerns you have working with a private construction company. The other group of students, what I set you up to do is to say, look, you are the construction partner, you're the private sector organisation, and you're about to meet with officials from the local government organisation who are wanting to commission the construction of this new school. So with that group of people, with the construction people, what I say is identify what objectives you have for the project, no doubt centering on profitability and so on, and also what concerns or issues you have about working with the public sector partner, and in terms of how you might develop that long-term partnership. Clearly, it's attractive to get a foot in the door and to start developing the partnership for future business, but what issues or concerns do you have in doing that? Okay, so I give you a few minutes to put forward your ideas on that. Before then, to meet up with the partners. And so what I do in small groups, I would normally in the lecture get you to meet with some of the people looking at the other side. So the government organisation would meet up with the constructor. So I'd want you to both present the objectives and issues you have, but also come to a conclusion as to what objectives and issues you might have in common, and which ones are likely to be unique, and how could you work together to realise your objectives and make the partnership work. Okay, so what I hope to get out of that is the fact that yes, you do have different objectives. Both parties have different objectives. Clearly the public sector, local government organisation, want to develop education within the schools, want to actually improve conditions for society and the local community where they're working, and obviously want to get good value for money through the partnership. The construction company is, of course, profit driven and motivated. However, it probably wants to be seen as a socially responsible organisation, and also is looking for working closely with that school, with that local authority, and trying to develop a long-term partnership, because then that is an access into future more or less guaranteed business if they do the job well. Clearly there might be some issues. Often private companies have concerns working with more bureaucratic public authorities, and likewise public authorities very often get concerned that their partners are driven by shareholders, or that there might be issues with senior managers. I mean, it's very current this year, because if you think about a company like Keele, which has recently gone into or been wound up, and clearly they had big public partnerships and were involved quite heavily, and clearly you can see the public organisations, the local government organisations and central government organisations felt very much let down by the fact that Keele were not able to deliver on those on its projects. Okay, so really the session was one of exploring some of those issues and bringing those to the fore. Okay, so that exercise was one where essentially we were introducing issues to do with public-private partnerships, PPPs. A PPP is a partnership between a government agency and a private sector company. And the notion is that we're using the private sector to finance, build and operate projects to get them off the ground. So essentially it's outsourcing a lot of the work that would otherwise require it to be done from within the government agency. So the argument is, I mean, we've sort of concentrated, if you like, locally, but if we start looking internationally, we can see that PPPs can be utilised for overseas governments to work with global multinational corporations, for example, to develop very much needed infrastructures and services. So what it does, it's using private sector innovation expertise, often leveraging and getting access to private finance, but delivering much required infrastructural projects for a society or for the community where the government is responsible. So clearly you can start to see there's a big difference between PPP or partnering and the traditional procurement that's done in public projects, whereby in the past people would just tender for an individual project. This is one where we're very much looking for a longer term relationship. So some of the benefits of PPPs are that private sector technology and innovation helps to provide better public services. We're into arguments here, for example, of private schools and schools being run by companies, hospitals being provided. If we look at the Royal Stoke Hospital, actually much of it is run by a private sector firm who commission the building of the hospital and continue to provide the services, whereas clearly the National Health Service and the government agencies provide the doctors, the nurses and so on that work within that hospital. The other thing is that the private partner is incentivised through contracts to deliver projects on time and within budget. And clearly you can see from an international perspective, this can really help in developing projects in emergent and developing countries where governments in emergent countries and developing countries can actually make use of, if they have the funding, make use of expertise, foreign businesses to actually come in and develop infrastructure. Some of the risks of public-private partnerships are to do with the bearing of this risk. Sometimes, and typically if the project overruns or exceeds cost estimates or has some technical difficulties, it's often the private partner who typically bears that burden. And we can see that again with the Carillion experience. No matter what we think about the background and what happened there, clearly the company went out of business. The government will still continue on. There are two videos you can watch. I normally just show the one video, but there are two that you can watch. So what you've got there is a United Nations perspective on public-private partnership, which is very important if we start looking at development projects internationally, and then also the World Bank perspective, having a look at another organisation that funds and manages many of these large infrastructural projects overseas. So that's quite interesting, and clearly what we're going to be doing next week is to move on to look at the management and development projects more generally. Okay, now let's just reflect upon some of the core reading. Custer chapter 10, which was recommended reading for this week. There is a section there looking at cooperation in international projects. So let's look at that. Now, the idea is that cooperation, effective cooperation and partnership is challenging because of the diversity and cultural differences between local agencies and foreign providers. Clearly, trust crops up again. This T word keeps cropping up, doesn't it? Trust is the basis for effective cooperation and partnering. We need to think about conflict management. So clearly a situation will arise. There are multiple causes for conflicts and different attitudes. And what we need to do is to think about how we manage that. Clearly, relationship management is all important. How we manage relations hopefully doesn't come to conflict, and also skills of negotiation and reasoning through the process. Project manager needs to foster a project ethos whereby people feel as if they have a degree of autonomy within the project, but other things such as trust, involvement, flexibility, adaptability, fairness, and clearly the need again for this notion of cultural intelligence, that people might be technically qualified, might be good at relationship management and sort of people intelligence otherwise, but clearly also are able to work with people from other backgrounds and cultures within international projects. And as I say, what we'll be doing is to move on to look at those issues in more detail next week when the lecture is going to be on international and development projects. Okay, so just summarising this week's lecture. The lecture has been on managing project partnerships, and the notion is, of course, that partnerships are built on trust. And we've covered the benefits of partnership. I've talked through the partnership exercise between the local government agency for the commissioning of a new school, and also the perspective of the construction company, the private construction company who will be working within this public-private partnership. And then we've looked at public-private partnerships more generally. We've sort of explored it with regards to particularly international projects. We've talked a little during the lecture about negotiating and contracts and how those are really important in setting the scenes and managing the partnership and the relationship going forward. And then finally, we made a link to next week. We've looked at the chapter 10 by Forrester, looked at some of the issues that she raises in that chapter regarding cooperation in international projects. And that's where we're going to move on to next week. Now, just finally, we're going to look at the exercise in tutorials. So what you did last week was you were introduced to the Whitbread World Sailboat Race case study. And essentially what we're going to be doing in tutorials this week is we will be running through a solution to that particular case. Now, clearly, what I will be doing is posting up solutions, running solutions to the KLE pages, which enable you to work through that. And also we'll be reflecting on that solution and the lessons learned from the case exercise. So that's week 7's lecture on partnership and contracting relationships, and a reminder that we were going to explore this case study, the Whitbread World Sailboat Race, developing the critical path, but then reflecting upon how we might crash times to bring the project back on time. Okay, thank you very much.